It's a pleasure to be here to address an issue of critical global importance, the fight against transnational corruption. Global corruption is one of the greatest challenges of our era. It distorts markets, weakens our governments, raises the cost of doing business, promotes inequalities, and erodes our sustainable development efforts. I'm happy here to see Leonard because the bank actually is, again, one of the institutions in the world that has been doing great work on this. We're talking about one of the biggest systemic threats of the 21st century, and it has to be combated with all our strength and all our intelligence, with the help of effective international agreements, treaties, and conventions. Combating corruption has become one of the top priorities for the OECD, and I'm therefore delighted to open this conference, and I thank Chatham House for the opportunity. Also like to take advantage of and thank the presence of Dominic Martin here. Dominic, of course, has been the ambassador to the OECD and as such supported our anti-corruption work throughout, and now is doing a very important work inside the British government in the interagency coordination system. Nothing like a big crisis to use it to strengthen the fight against corruption. And we had as good as it gets when you talk about a crisis. Let me start by pointing to a major wake-up call in this fight against corruption. The crisis actually left a lot of legacies, but one of the most important revelations is that there is an urgent need to build a stronger, more transparent, better coordinated regulatory framework for the global economy. All participants in economic transactions need to develop together a set of common rules, whether on tax evasion, on public procurement, on due diligence, corporate governance, conflict of interest, lobbying, bribery, among others. And we need a joint effort to implement and keep updating these rules through effective and inclusive multilateral cooperation. The OECD has been intensifying its work to help countries build and implement these new frameworks and these new rules in a wide spectrum of policy areas, with an arsenal of quote-unquote soft laws, benchmarks, studies, peer pressure mechanisms. Let me mention a few examples. Our work on base erosion and profit shifting, so-called BEPS, that's on taxes, is providing governments with new domestic and international tools to fight tax avoidance. Our guidance for multinational enterprises provide voluntary principles and standards for responsible business conduct to 45 signatory countries. Our principles for transparency and integrity and lobbying are helping to improve governance and accountability in an increasingly important activity. Now, we of course produced this one to explain what it is that we were doing in the group on bribery. Bribery and Corruption Awareness Handbook for tax examiners and tax auditors. Specialized anti-corruption institutions, review of models, second edition, Anti-Corruption Network for Eastern Europe and Central Asia. This one, OECD Integrity Review of Italy, following the OECD Integrity Review of Brazil, okay? And we're now have been asked, because this is a G8 and a G20 country, by other large countries to engage in this kind of work. Measuring OECD responses to illicit financial flows from developing countries. And this one, which is Government at a Glance, and which, among other things, focuses on the question of transparency, integrity, and the structures that one has to put in place in governments in order to avoid and eventually fight corruption. Now, there are a number of legacies, as I said, in the crisis: slow growth, high unemployment, growing inequalities. But there's a fourth legacy that is particularly dangerous, perilous, and that is the erosion of public trust in our governments. According to our Government at a Glance study, the one I just showed you, confidence in national governments in OECD countries now stands at a record low level of 40%. We're also helping countries recover that trust. Our principles for enhancing integrity in public procurement are helping governments promote transparency, good management, monitoring, and accountability in these procedures. We're also helping to reduce the risk of capturing of politicians by promoting more stringent and transparent rules for financing of political campaigns. One of the great scourges of our modern times. How do we finance our democratic process? How do we finance our political parties? How do we finance our campaigns, etc.? We also launched a Clean Gov Biz initiative, which draws together the OECD's anti-corruption tools, reinforces their implementation, improves coordination among relevant players, and monitors progress towards integrity. But let me focus in more depth on one of the fields in which we've developed more expertise in global clout, the fight against international bribery, where the OECD Convention on Combating Bribery of Foreign Public Officials in International Business Transactions. It's a very long title. Let me go again. The OECD Convention on Combating Bribery of Foreign Public Officials in International Business Transactions has become a global reference. Now, it's very difficult to calculate the exact cost of corruption. Some have estimated that every year, close to $1 trillion pollute our systems and go to waste in bribes, generating a cascade of negative synergies for our economies, but most importantly, for the life prospects of our people. Actually, the World Bank also made some calculations about what percentage of GDPs are distracted or deviated from their original objectives. And as we know, it's not the amount of money that people take in their pockets home or put in a secret bank account. It's the big damage that is done that lasts decades and decades when you do the wrong choices because you are otherwise induced. And therefore, that is, of course, part of the conviction that we must have. Now, not so long ago, this practice of the bribery actually was still considered part of doing business. And in many countries, bribes were still treated as a tax-deductible expense, as you know. This is not so long ago, really. Fortunately, after years of hard work, the OECD Anti-Bribery Convention was promulgated and entered into force in February of 1999, becoming the first legally binding international instrument to focus exclusively on active bribery in business transactions. The Convention's rigorous peer review mechanism, the OECD Working Group on Bribery, has been referred to as a gold standard by Transparency International. By the way, where is the representative of Transparency International here? Because they breathe down our necks all the time. And they keep us on the straight and narrow, if you will. We've had COBUS, and we have only recently, a few literally days ago, and of course, UGET is always reminding us that Big Brother, or in this case, Big Sister, is watching. Now, the group today counts 41 member countries. Of course, there are 34 members of the OECD. That means we have 7 more. Argentina, Brazil, Bulgaria, Colombia, Latvia, Russia, South Africa. So quite interesting countries that have chosen, they say Argentina, Brazil, Bulgaria, Colombia, Latvia, Russia, South Africa, from different parts of the world, different sizes, different impacts, many of them joining now the OECD. In the case of Colombia, Latvia, Russia, they are now moving into becoming OECD members. There's still some key players missing: China, India, Indonesia, Saudi Arabia. Well, we're committed to convince them to join this fight. Now, many countries have made radical changes to the laws and institutions to comply with the convention. Governments had to make it a crime for their nationals and their companies to pay bribes to public officials abroad in order to win business. They had to make it a crime. Yes, because, of course, otherwise it was not consistent with the convention. When signed into law, it becomes a law of the land. You know, it is and it also has the level of international treaties, so it has to be enforced, it has to be enacted. And we'll see that we have not been half as successful there as we would want to be. Now, this question of making it a crime for the nationals, for companies to pay bribes to public officials abroad, has been achieved by all member countries, with one of the most recent examples here in the UK through the Uk Bribery Act, which entered into force in 2011, following rather rigorous and repeated OECD reviews. I have to say, personally, I participated in that from day one, and we are very proud that the OECD now has state-of-the-art, not only the law, but also, how do you call it, Nicola, the orientations or the guidance or the guiding principles or something like that. There was which took yet another year, discussions between the CBI and the government and the Department of Justice, etc. But in the end, we have now really, literally a state-of-the-art, which only recently was practically copied, although not terribly efficiently copied by a couple of other countries, and we're trying to tell them, no, that's not quite what the British meant. So we may ask Dominic to come to those countries to say, no, this is what we really mean. The convention has helped governments to enforce anti-bribery laws and secure convictions. Between 1999 and December 2012, 221 individuals, 90 companies were sanctioned for foreign bribery in 13 countries. The record fine for a foreign bribery case was imposed against a German company, and which, by the way, has now incurred in a very large amount in total sanctions across 4 jurisdictions, and criminal proceedings continue. That was a country which was very resistant to start, and once they got started, apparently it's moving along. We also know 320 ongoing investigations into alleged acts of foreign bribery in 24 parties to the convention. This is, of course, good news. Now, today there are 6 other multilateral anti-corruption conventions. And there is an increasing number of mechanisms in place to facilitate cooperation among law enforcement authorities, including the biannual informal meetings of law enforcement authorities that takes place at the OECD. Anti-bribery has now become a key priority for a number of international institutions. There's even a dedicated G20 anti-bribery working group with which we work very, very closely. These are very important achievements all. Now, so this is the pat on the back we give ourselves. But in spite of this remarkable progress, challenges still persist. Over half the working group on bribery member countries have yet to successfully prosecute a foreign bribery case. Over half the working group on bribery member countries have yet to successfully prosecute a foreign bribery case. We believe we either have found the chemically pure, perfectly corruption-less countries, or if that seems far-fetched and improbable, we clearly feel that these countries are not committed enough, are not convinced enough, and basically should, because this is about the level playing field. Whenever I meet a group of businessmen, and I meet many of them about this, and the first thing they say is, yes, but, and then they give me the litany of all the countries that have not yet prosecuted a single case, or, of course, of the demand side. Because remember, when this was born, we thought we had the monopoly of the issue because we control the supply side. Of course, this was 15 years ago. Now, every single country has companies that operate, even if it's a small country, that operate internationally. And those companies may very well fall into temptation of trying to facilitate their business dealings and obtain, profit by illegitimate means. And frankly, sometimes it happens that the less experience these countries have with these types of mechanisms, the more they fall into the temptation, or sometimes because they were themselves subject to these pressures and they were being offered bribes by the contractors of the other countries, and therefore they thought it was a way of normal way of doing business, and this was okay. So there's a problem, and we obviously have not yet tested if there are people who are, more or less, prone to fall into these kinds of temptations. We believe there aren't. We believe the question is the context. We believe the question is the rules. We believe the question is the culture. And we believe that everybody who can operate with impunity will, and everybody who will be stopped by the context will be stopped. Or at least that there's a higher likelihood that they will not engage or incur in this improper conduct. So, a number of emerging economies have not yet criminalized foreign bribery in spite of various international obligations to which they have subscribed. Mind you, they all have corruption as an offense in their own domestic. But again, it's only recently that their companies have been going out, and therefore they do not feel in many cases the need to put that in their own criminal codes. And we are now working with many of these countries to say, put that in the criminal codes. And certainly when they want to join the OECD, like in the case of Russia, like in the case of Colombia, like in the case of Latvia, like in the case of Costa Rica, etc., the first thing we tell them is, by the way, you have to sign on to this, which means you have to change your laws. But I have to say, every one of the new candidates has done so with gusto. Our own countries do not always appear to be totally coherent. Political leaders may be tempted to defend their national companies, even when such companies are suspected or even found guilty of corruption. Recent cases show state-owned or state-controlled enterprises can indulge in improper behavior as much as privately owned companies. That's another dimension of the problem. And law enforcement authorities do not always share information to assist their counterparts in international investigations. We call it competitive neutrality. This is a very elegant way to deal with the question of how do state-owned enterprises act in market-like environments. Should we or should we know? They should be treated, of course, like any other company, and they should abide by the rules. So we're not saying here privatization, no privatization, just play by the rules. But clearly, this is an angle, the anti-corruption, where this sometimes is not happening. Businesses also need to take a closer look in the mirror. The overwhelming majority of cases concluded to date have involved systemic corruption across international operations of major multinational enterprises. And this lies at the heart of the unprecedented crisis of trust that our countries are facing. Corporations need to stop bribing public officials, and that is going to help to recover public trust and legitimacy. But most importantly, it's going to allow markets to work. Again, it's a business question, the proverbial level playing field. It's going to allow governments to provide good public services, and it's going to allow economies to increase their competitiveness. So, how do we achieve all this? Well, I'll take just a couple of minutes more. We need to move ahead in several fronts. First and foremost, all major economic players must be part of the effort. It is imperative that all G20 countries become parties to the OECD Anti-Bribery Convention. I told you which were missing, China, India, Indonesia, and Saudi Arabia. We also need to be consistent in terms of enforcement. And for that to happen, law enforcement authorities need to have sufficient independence, and also they need to have the financial and the human resources. In many cases, the legal framework is fine. The predicate offenses there and everything else, it's just right. But the problem is they don't have the wherewithal. In addition, the playing field must be leveled both on the supply side as well as on the demand side of transnational corruption. Cases in which a company and/or an individual are punished for having bribed a foreign public official must be accompanied by the investigation and prosecution of the foreign public official in question. I would say, and vice versa, because of the case I just mentioned, where the foreign public official in question was actually sanctioned and punished, and the origin of the problem was not. We must also become more sophisticated in our analysis of the drivers and methods of corruption. Lawyers, accountants, auditors need to be much more aware of the risks they face when advising international business transactions. Ratings agencies should also include corruption risks in their analysis of companies. I have a note here that says, as far as I know, only one has done so, which is Fitch. So I don't know if this is exactly the case, but I would have to say that here this is a big driver, because companies are very aware of what rating agencies write about themselves. Last but not least, international organizations need to establish a common vision and a common agenda on the way forward. The OECD will keep working hard to strengthen and broaden its work on anti-corruption. We'll keep bringing the stakeholders together to inclusive multilateral events. And by the way, there's a second OECD annual Integrity Week, which will take place in Paris in mid-March, and you are all invited to attend. Now, I therefore take the opportunity of being here at Chatham House, this platform for the improvement of the world, to invite the leaders of the 41 member countries of the OECD Working Group on Bribery to lead by example, to commit to the full implementation and enforcement of the Convention. And I also take this chance to announce that in 2014, on the occasion of the 15th anniversary of the Convention, we will be seeking the endorsement of our ministers of a high-level political statement to strengthen the anti-corruption efforts. This is something this is like climate change, you just have to keep at it, even at the risk of repeating past statements, because you always have to be reminding people that this is on the agenda. Now, ladies and gentlemen, our decisions, our agreements, our treaties, our conventions, most of all our actions, can reduce the space for bribery and dishonesty. We can eradicate corruption, or at least reduce it considerably. But for that, we need a collective response, multilateral efforts, multidisciplinary programs. And the OECD is working on these lines. But we need you all to succeed. We need your help to succeed. We need your collective effort to succeed. Remember the words of Einstein: "The world will not be destroyed by those who do evil, but by those who watch them without doing anything." Thank you.